Sometimes the most valuable person in the room is the one everyone is trying to ignore. The revolving doors of Bennett Technologies turned without pause as executives in tailored suits hurried across the gleaming marble lobby beneath towering glass walls that reflected the bright Chicago morning skyline. Expensive shoes echoed across the polished floor. Conversations about billion-dollar contracts floated through the air. No one noticed the man standing quietly near the reception desk with a worn canvas backpack resting against his leg and a carefully folded job application held in steady hands. Daniel Foster had not come searching for recognition. He had come searching for honest work. His faded denim jacket had been brushed clean before sunrise, and although the leather on his work boots showed years of use, every lace had been tied with care. Dignity, he believed, was never measured by what a man owned, but by how faithfully he carried himself when life became difficult. The receptionist accepted his application without looking up from her computer. "Position?" she asked. "Janitor," Daniel answered with calm confidence. Her fingers paused for only a second before she pointed toward the Human Resources office on the 4th floor. "Take the elevator to your left." Daniel thanked her with a quiet smile before walking toward the elevators, blending almost invisibly into the sea of professionals rushing around him. A few minutes later, he sat across from a recruiter who scanned his application with growing confusion. "There are long gaps in your employment history," she observed. "Yes. You have an engineering degree." "I do. Why would someone like you apply for custodial work?" Daniel folded his hands together before answering. "Because every honest job deserves respect, and my daughter deserves stability." Before the recruiter could respond, the office door opened. Richard Cole, the company's chief operating officer, stepped inside while reviewing several files. He was known throughout the building for demanding perfection and rewarding only results. His sharp eyes landed on Daniel's application, lying open across the desk. He casually reached for the folder and read the name printed across the top page. Daniel Foster. His expression hardened immediately. "This application should never have made it this far," Richard said coldly. "We are building the future, not collecting broken careers." The recruiter looked uncomfortable. "He only wants the janitor position." Richard closed the folder and slid it toward the discard tray without another glance at Daniel. "Remove it from the system." Daniel remained completely still. There was no anger in his face. No argument. No plea. He simply stood, thanked the recruiter for her time, picked up his backpack, and turned toward the door. Just as his hand touched the handle, another voice stopped the room. "Who authorized that decision?" The office fell silent. Victoria Bennett stood in the doorway wearing a perfectly tailored navy business suit, accompanied by two senior executives who immediately sensed the unusual tension. Richard forced a polite smile. Nothing important. Just an unsuitable applicant. Victoria's eyes drifted toward the application resting on the desk. Without speaking, she picked it up. Her gaze settled on the name at the top of the page. Daniel Foster. The color slowly disappeared from her face. The folder trembled slightly in her hands as memories she had spent years trying to bury came rushing back all at once. The executives beside her exchanged puzzled glances while Richard's confident expression faded into uncertainty. Victoria looked up from the application and met Daniel's calm eyes for the first time in more than 15 years. Neither of them spoke. The silence seemed to swallow the entire room. Finally, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she asked the question that left everyone frozen where they stood. "Who told Mr. Foster he was allowed to leave this building?" Victoria Bennett continued looking at Daniel Foster as though the years between them had vanished in a single heartbeat. Richard Cole cleared his throat, attempting to recover control of the room. "Victoria, there is no reason to delay today's schedule over a custodial applicant." She never took her eyes off Daniel. "Please step outside, Richard." The words were calm, yet no one mistook them for a request. Richard hesitated for only a moment before leaving with the human resources recruiter, closing the office door behind them. Silence settled over the room like morning fog. Daniel stood with his canvas backpack resting against one shoulder, his expression peaceful despite the questions filling the air. Victoria finally spoke. "I searched for your name years ago." Daniel smiled gently without surprise. "Then you already know you would not have found me." She lowered her eyes toward the application in her hands. "Why are you here?" "Because there is an opening for a janitor." "Daniel." Her voice softened. "I am asking why you are really here." He answered with the same quiet honesty that had guided him through every difficult season of his life. I need steady work. I need health insurance. My daughter deserves stability, and this company offers both. Victoria studied his face, searching for traces of the ambitious engineer she had admired long ago. Instead, she found something stronger. Peace earned through hardship. You could have asked for anything, she whispered. Daniel slowly shook his head. No, I came to ask for exactly what I need, nothing more. She glanced again at the long employment gaps listed on the application. Repair shops, warehouse maintenance, delivery driving, temporary construction. None of it reflected the extraordinary mind she remembered. You never contacted anyone, she said. There were people who would have helped. Daniel looked toward the city skyline beyond the office windows where sunlight reflected from neighboring towers. People offered enough kindness while my wife was ill. After she passed away, my responsibility became raising Emily, not rebuilding my reputation. Victoria felt her throat tighten. Before she could speak again, a soft knock interrupted them. Richard stepped back into the office carrying a tablet. The board meeting begins in 5 minutes. Victoria nodded without looking away from Daniel. Please postpone it. Richard stared in disbelief. For how long? Until I say otherwise. His frustration showed for only an instant before professional discipline returned. Very well. As the door closed again, Victoria placed Daniel's application neatly on the desk instead of returning it to the discard tray. Would you accept the janitor position if it were offered today? Daniel answered immediately. Yes. Even after everything that happened here. This building is not responsible for the past. She gave a faint smile. You still sound exactly the same. Daniel quietly laughed. Emily tells me I repeat myself too often. The mention of his daughter brightened his face in a way nothing else had. Victoria noticed it instantly. How old is she? 9. Does she know where you are today? She knows her father is trying to find honest work. Victoria slowly closed the folder. Then I think she deserves some good news. She pressed the intercom and asked Human Resources to prepare the employment paperwork immediately. Daniel looked at her with sincere gratitude, but no excitement beyond that of a father who had simply found a way to provide for his child. As he signed the documents a few minutes later, neither of them noticed Richard standing outside the glass office wall, watching through partially closed blinds, his expression growing colder as one question echoed through his mind. Why would the billionaire chief executive officer personally hire a man whose name should have been forgotten long ago? Daniel Foster arrived 45 minutes before sunrise on his first day, parking his aging pickup truck behind Bennett Technologies while the city still rested beneath a pale blue morning sky. He stepped out carrying the same worn canvas backpack and quietly looked up at the glass tower that had once been part of another lifetime. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only gratitude for the opportunity to begin again. Inside the service entrance, Marcus Hill greeted him with a warm handshake and handed him a neatly folded Navy custodial uniform, an identification badge, and a ring of building keys. Welcome aboard, Marcus said with an easy smile. Most people never notice the work we do around here, but they certainly notice when it is not done. Daniel nodded. That means it matters. Marcus laughed softly. I think we are going to get along just fine. Within an hour, Daniel had memorized supply closets, maintenance routes, emergency exits, and cleaning schedules. He worked with quiet precision, leaving every hallway brighter than he had found it without ever drawing attention to himself. Employees hurried past carrying laptops, coffee cups, and presentation folders. Some offered polite smiles. Others barely noticed him. Daniel greeted everyone with the same calm respect regardless of whether they acknowledged him. Late that morning, he entered a conference room moments after a strategy meeting had ended. Coffee cups sat scattered across the table beside stacks of engineering diagrams. As he carefully gathered the empty cups, he noticed a young engineering intern standing alone near the large digital display, staring anxiously at a complex facility blueprint. The young man sighed in frustration before quietly saying to himself, "Nothing lines up." Daniel glanced toward the screen for only a second before continuing his work. "May I ask one question?" he said gently. The intern looked surprised. "Of course." Daniel pointed toward a ventilation layout displayed in one corner of the drawing. "What happens if every measurement is correct, but your starting reference point is 4 inches off?" The intern blinked, turned back toward the blueprint, and quickly recalculated the entire design. Within seconds, his face brightened. "That is it," he whispered. "The reference point is wrong." He looked back toward Daniel with amazement. "How did you see that so quickly?" Daniel smiled while tying the trash bag closed. Sometimes the smallest beginning changes everything that follows. Before the intern could ask another question, Daniel politely excused himself and wheeled his custodial cart into the hallway. Several floors above, Victoria Bennett watched security footage from her office, not because she doubted Daniel, but because she wanted to understand the man he had become. She saw him encourage the intern without introducing himself. She saw him stop to help an elderly receptionist carry heavy archive boxes. She saw him straighten a crooked family photograph on an employee's desk before quietly walking away. Every small act reminded her of the engineer she had admired years ago, a man who had always solved problems without asking anyone to remember his name. Meanwhile, Richard Cole reviewed reports from department managers and frowned when he learned an intern had corrected an expensive design mistake after speaking with the new janitor. He leaned back slowly, tapping a pen against his desk. "No one changes technical drawings after a conversation with a custodian," he muttered. His eyes narrowed as another uncomfortable thought settled into his mind. Daniel Foster was becoming visible, and Richard had spent far too many years making certain that never happened. The following morning settled over Chicago beneath a blanket of soft gray clouds as Bennett Technologies awakened to another demanding day. Daniel Foster moved quietly through the executive floors with his custodial cart, polishing glass doors until they reflected the first rays of sunlight that finally broke through the skyline. His movements were calm and deliberate, almost effortless, as though every hallway deserved the same care regardless of who walked through it. Employees greeted him with brief smiles, and several had already begun thanking him for remembering their names. Daniel believed respect was easiest to give when no reward was expected. Shortly before noon, an unusual tension spread across the engineering department. Groups of software architects gathered around conference room monitors while urgent conversations echoed through the hallway. A major client presentation was only hours away, yet one of the company's facility integration models refused to synchronize with the newest operating platform. Voices grew sharper. Deadlines grew shorter. Daniel paused outside the open conference room while replacing a trash liner. He never stepped inside. He simply listened for a moment as experienced engineers debated complicated solutions that only seemed to create more confusion. On the edge of a nearby whiteboard, someone had sketched a simple process diagram. Daniel studied it for less than 5 seconds before quietly reaching into his pocket for a small notepad. Without entering the room, he wrote one sentence in neat handwriting. "Verify the original calibration sequence before changing the architecture." He folded the note once and handed it to the same young engineering intern he had encouraged the day before. "You may want to show this to your supervisor," Daniel said gently. "It could save some time." The intern accepted the note, thanked him, and hurried back inside. Daniel continued down the hallway without looking back. 15 minutes later, excitement replaced frustration inside the conference room. One senior engineer stared at the restored system with complete disbelief. "The calibration sequence," he whispered. "We skipped the original baseline after the update." Another engineer quickly confirmed the discovery, and within minutes the integration model was functioning perfectly again. The department celebrated solving a problem that had delayed the project for nearly 2 days. No one could explain how the answer had appeared so simply. Upstairs, Victoria Bennett watched the security footage from multiple camera angles. She saw Daniel stop outside the room. She saw him write a single note. She saw him quietly continue working without waiting for recognition. A faint smile crossed her face, followed almost immediately by sadness. Nothing about him had changed except the weight life had placed upon his shoulders. He still solved impossible problems by making them appear simple. Across the building, Richard Cole reviewed the incident report and demanded to know where the handwritten suggestion had originated. When the intern honestly explained that the new janitor had offered the idea, Richard's expression darkened. "Bring me that note," he ordered. Moments later, he held the folded paper in his hand, reading the sentence again and again. His eyes slowly drifted toward the signature at the bottom. There was none. Daniel had deliberately left no name behind. Richard walked to the executive archives overlooking the atrium and stared through the glass toward the lobby several floors below, where Daniel quietly polished a brass handrail while greeting employees with the same humble smile. Richard tightened his grip on the note. Too many coincidences were beginning to surround a man who was supposed to have disappeared from the company's story forever, and for the first time in many years, the future he had carefully built no longer felt completely secure. By Friday afternoon, Victoria Bennett could no longer dismiss the growing certainty forming in her heart. Every security recording, every quiet conversation, and every small act of kindness pointed toward the same truth. Daniel Foster was still the man she remembered. Life had changed his circumstances, but it had never changed his character. After the final executive meeting ended, she walked alone toward the oldest section of the company headquarters where forgotten records had been stored for decades. Dust rested quietly upon rows of gray archive boxes, while the faint scent of aged paper filled the silent room. Waiting beside a long wooden table stood Walter Grant, one of the original founders who had officially retired years earlier but still served as the company's living memory. He smiled gently the moment Victoria entered. "I wondered how long it would take before you came looking," he said. Victoria held Daniel's employment application in one hand. "I need to understand why someone like him disappeared." Walter slowly opened a weathered storage box marked with the company's earliest project numbers. Inside were engineering journals, handwritten notebooks, patent applications, faded photographs, and meeting records from more than 16 years before. He carefully lifted an old photograph and placed it on the table. It showed a much younger Daniel standing beside a small team of engineers, smiling modestly, while everyone around him celebrated the company's first major breakthrough. "That was the day Bennett Technologies survived," Walter said quietly. Victoria studied the image with trembling hands. "He was never mentioned in the public announcement." Walter nodded sadly. "Because he asked us not to mention him." He reached for another folder containing letters written by employees during the company's earliest years. One thanked Daniel for staying after work every evening to teach new engineers. Another described how he quietly paid medical insurance for a struggling coworker without allowing anyone to discover the truth. Every page revealed the same pattern. Daniel solved problems. Daniel encouraged people. Daniel walked away before anyone could applaud. Victoria opened one final envelope, sealed with fading tape. Inside rested Daniel's handwritten resignation letter. The ink had softened with age, but every word remained clear. He thanked the company for believing in impossible dreams, apologized for leaving unexpectedly, and explained only that his wife needed him more than any career ever could. There was no complaint, no request for recognition, and no mention of the inventions that had transformed the company forever. The final sentence left Victoria unable to speak. "If this company continues serving people with honesty and respect, then everything I built here will still have meaning." She carefully folded the letter and looked toward Walter with eyes filled by quiet emotion. "Why did nobody tell this story?" Walter released a long breath before answering. "Because Daniel insisted that the mission mattered more than the man." Then time moved forward, leaders changed, records disappeared, and too many people found it convenient to remember success without remembering sacrifice. At that same moment, several floors below, Daniel finished arranging chairs inside a conference room before noticing a framed company photograph hanging slightly crooked on the wall. He paused only long enough to straighten it with careful hands, then continued pushing his custodial cart down the hallway, completely unaware that the past he had tried so hard to leave behind was slowly walking toward him once again. Standing alone inside the archive room, Victoria closed the final box and made a quiet promise to herself. The truth had remained hidden long enough, and before another week passed, the entire company would finally learn the name of the man whose dignity had built far more than a business. Monday morning began with an unusual stillness inside Bennett Technologies, as though the building itself sensed that something long forgotten was about to return. Daniel Foster arrived before sunrise as always, quietly unlocking supply closets, checking equipment, and greeting the overnight security team with the same warm smile that had already become familiar throughout the building. He believed every day deserved the same faithful beginning regardless of what had happened the day before. While most executives measured success by meetings and reports, Daniel measured it by whether someone else's burden became lighter before he went home. Upstairs, Victoria Bennett sat alone inside her office with Daniel's resignation letter resting beside a stack of archived engineering records. She had barely slept. Every document she had read over the weekend confirmed the same painful truth. The company she now led had been built upon sacrifices very few people even remembered, and the man responsible was quietly polishing floors only a few stories below. She pressed the intercom. "Please ask Walter Grant to join me." Minutes later, the retired founder entered carrying another weathered folder. "I found something else," he said softly. Victoria opened it to discover handwritten project journals filled with Daniel's careful notes. Every technical solution ended with reminders about encouraging younger engineers, sharing knowledge freely, and protecting the dignity of every member of the team. One sentence stopped her completely. "The strongest companies are not built by brilliant minds alone. They are built by ordinary people who choose kindness every day." Victoria closed the journal and whispered, "He has been living these words all along." Meanwhile, Richard Cole sat inside his executive office reviewing reports from every department that had recently interacted with Daniel. The list disturbed him more with every page. Employees described the new janitor as thoughtful, dependable, and unexpectedly insightful. One intern wrote that a single question from Daniel had prevented an expensive design mistake. Another manager praised the spotless condition of meeting rooms, while mentioning that morale seemed noticeably higher since Daniel had joined the maintenance staff. Richard leaned back slowly. None of this fit the version of history he preferred. If Daniel continued earning quiet respect throughout the company, sooner or later people would begin asking questions about the past. He stood and walked directly to human resources. "I want every access record connected to Daniel Foster," he said firmly. "Every hallway entry, every maintenance log, every camera location." The human resources director looked confused. "Has there been a complaint?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Not yet." Downstairs, Daniel finished cleaning a conference room before noticing an elderly employee struggling to carry several heavy archive binders toward the records department. Without a word, he stepped forward, accepted half the load, and walked beside the man through the quiet hallway. Neither of them discussed company history. They simply spoke about grandchildren, baseball, and the unusually warm spring weather. As they reached the archive room, Walter Grant happened to open the door from inside. The two men stopped for a brief moment. Walter looked directly at Daniel with gentle recognition. Daniel smiled respectfully and nodded. "Good morning, Mr. Grant." Walter returned the smile. "It is good to see you again, son." The exchange lasted only seconds before Daniel quietly continued down the hallway with his custodial cart. Victoria had witnessed everything through the partially open archive doorway. She watched Daniel disappear around the corner without asking for acknowledgement, exactly as he had done years before. In that quiet moment, she reached a decision that could no longer wait. She turned toward Walter with calm certainty and said, "Reserve the main auditorium for Friday afternoon. Invite every employee, every executive, every board member, and everyone who helped build this company in the beginning. It is time the truth stopped hiding." Friday afternoon arrived beneath a clear blue Chicago sky, yet inside Bennett Technologies an unusual tension filled every hallway. Employees from every department had received the same unexpected calendar invitation from Victoria Bennett requesting their attendance in the main auditorium. No explanation had been included. Engineers quietly speculated about a major acquisition. Financial managers expected an important corporate announcement. Even members of the board admitted they had no idea why every employee, from senior executives to custodial staff, had been instructed to gather together. Daniel Foster finished polishing the marble lobby just before 2 o'clock and gently returned his supplies to the maintenance room. Marcus Hill walked over holding a printed schedule with a puzzled smile. "Looks like we are all going," he said. Daniel glanced at the paper. "Maintenance too?" Marcus nodded. "Every single employee." Daniel washed his hands, straightened his navy uniform, and quietly followed the rest of the custodial team toward the auditorium. He naturally chose a seat in the last row beside Marcus, believing the meeting had nothing to do with him. As hundreds of employees settled into their seats, Richard Cole stood near the entrance watching the audience with growing unease. He had spent the entire week reviewing old company records, hoping to find something that would discredit Daniel before Victoria could move forward with whatever she had planned. Instead, Every archived document only confirmed Daniel's extraordinary contributions. Still unwilling to accept what was coming, Richard quietly approached Victoria backstage. "This is a mistake," he said in a low voice. "You are about to build company history around someone who walked away." Victoria calmly met his eyes. He walked away to care for his family. Richard crossed his arms. He abandoned the company. Before Victoria could answer, Walter Grant stepped beside her carrying a weathered leather portfolio. His voice remained gentle, yet every word carried unmistakable weight. "No, Richard. He saved the company before he left it." Richard fell silent as Walter continued. "The only reason any of us are standing inside this building today is because Daniel Foster refused to give up when everyone else believed we were finished." Victoria accepted the portfolio from Walter and walked toward the stage without another word. The auditorium lights slowly dimmed. Conversations faded until only quiet expectation remained. Victoria stood beneath a single spotlight and looked across the faces of engineers, receptionists, custodians, executives, interns, security officers, and retired employees who had returned for the special gathering. She did not begin with financial results or corporate achievements. Instead, she held up an old engineering notebook worn by time. "Every successful company has a story," she said softly. "Sometimes the most important chapter is the one almost forgotten." The large screen behind her illuminated with an old photograph from 16 years earlier, showing a small engineering team celebrating the company's first breakthrough. Murmurs spread across the auditorium as familiar faces appeared on the screen. Then another image replaced it. Original patent documents. Then handwritten design sketches. Then project journals filled with detailed notes. The same signature quietly appeared again and again. Daniel Foster. Employees looked at one another in confusion. Marcus slowly turned toward Daniel sitting beside him. Daniel lowered his eyes, saying nothing. Victoria took a slow breath before speaking once more. "For many years we celebrated the success of this company without recognizing the man whose integrity helped make that success possible." She stepped down from the stage and began walking slowly through the center aisle toward the last row. Every head in the auditorium followed her. Richard remained frozen where he stood. Walter watched with quiet satisfaction. Daniel looked up only when Victoria finally stopped directly in front of him. She smiled with gratitude rather than authority and gently extended her hand. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice carrying through the silent auditorium, "would you please come with me? It is time everyone learns the truth that should have been told a very long time ago." Daniel Foster looked at Victoria Bennett's outstretched hand for several quiet seconds before accepting it with the same humility that had shaped every chapter of his life. Together they walked slowly toward the stage while hundreds of employees watched in complete silence. Daniel did not search the room for familiar faces. He did not look toward the executives or the board members. His attention remained on the floor ahead of him, as though the recognition waiting at the front of the auditorium belonged to someone else entirely. When they reached the stage, Victoria turned toward the audience with eyes filled by gratitude rather than triumph. 16 years ago, she began softly. This company faced a moment when failure seemed unavoidable. Investors were leaving. Projects were collapsing. Many believed our doors would soon close forever. One man refused to accept that ending. Behind her, the large screen displayed scanned pages from Daniel's original engineering journals, followed by patent filings, project diagrams, and handwritten notes carrying the same careful signature. Walter Grant stepped forward carrying the weathered leather portfolio and addressed the audience with calm conviction. "I was here when these pages were written. I watched Daniel remain in this building long after everyone else went home. I watched him solve problems no consultant believed could be solved. More importantly, I watched him teach young engineers that character mattered more than talent." The room remained perfectly still. Victoria continued. "When success finally came, Daniel asked that others receive the public recognition because he believed the mission mattered more than his own name." She paused before taking a slow breath. Years later, when his wife became seriously ill, he quietly left to care for his family. He never demanded compensation. He never returned asking for credit. He simply became the father his daughter needed. Several employees lowered their heads while others wiped away quiet tears. Marcus Hill smiled proudly from the last row. The young engineering intern who had learned from Daniel earlier that week stared at the stage with newfound admiration. Victoria turned toward Daniel. On behalf of Bennett Technologies, I owe you an apology. We accepted the foundation you built without making certain future generations knew who had built it. Daniel smiled gently. You do not owe me anything. Victoria looked surprised. How can you say that after everything? Daniel answered with the same peaceful voice that had comforted his daughter through difficult years. Because resentment cannot build a better tomorrow. I chose my family. I would make the same choice again. A quiet murmur of respect moved across the auditorium. Victoria nodded slowly before speaking once more. Then allow me to offer something that should have been yours long ago. She held out an executive appointment folder embossed with the company seal. I would like you to become our Chief Innovation Officer, with full authority, restored equity, and every honor this company can provide. The audience held its breath. Richard Cole stood motionless near the side wall, unable to look away. Daniel accepted the folder only long enough to read the first page before carefully closing it again. He returned it to Victoria with both hands. Thank you, he said sincerely. Your kindness means more than you know. But I cannot accept this position. A wave of astonishment spread through the auditorium. Victoria searched his face, certain she had misunderstood. May I ask why? Daniel looked toward the maintenance team seated together near the back of the room before answering. I came here searching for honest work, not my old office. Every person in this building deserves the same respect whether they write software, answer phones, or polish these floors. If I only valued dignity after standing on this stage, then I would have forgotten everything life has taught me. The silence that followed carried more power than applause ever could. And in that unforgettable moment, nearly every person inside the auditorium realized they were witnessing a kind of greatness that no title could ever create. The auditorium remained silent for several long moments before Walter Grant slowly rose from his seat and began applauding. The sound was steady rather than loud, filled with gratitude instead of celebration. One by one, engineers, receptionists, security officers, custodians, interns, executives, and board members followed until every person inside Bennett Technologies stood together. Daniel Foster lowered his head for a brief moment, humbled by a respect he had never sought. When the applause finally faded, Victoria Bennett stepped closer with a warm smile that carried neither authority nor pride. Then I will not ask you to become someone you no longer wish to be, she said softly. Instead, I would like to ask something far more valuable. Will you help us become the company you always hoped we could be? Daniel looked at her with quiet curiosity. Victoria continued. Remain exactly where your heart tells you to serve. Keep reminding us that character comes before achievement. Spend time with our interns, our maintenance staff, our young engineers, and anyone willing to learn. Titles can be assigned in a meeting. Wisdom cannot. Daniel smiled gently. That is a responsibility I would gladly accept. A peaceful warmth settled across the auditorium. Richard Cole quietly lowered his eyes, recognizing that the respect filling the room had never come from power, but from integrity. In the weeks that followed, Bennett Technologies began changing in ways that could not be measured on financial reports. Managers greeted custodians by name. Executives spent more time listening than speaking. Mentorship sessions became a regular part of the company culture, and Daniel often sat with new employees over simple cups of coffee, asking thoughtful questions instead of giving long speeches. His greatest lessons were usually only a few words. Listen before leading. Protect people before protecting pride. Success means very little if no one feels respected. One crisp autumn morning, employees arriving through the main lobby noticed a bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance where everyone would pass before beginning work. It did not celebrate quarterly profits, market value, or technological breakthroughs. It carried a simple inscription. The strongest foundations are built by people who quietly choose character every single day. Beneath those words appeared one name, Daniel Foster. Daniel himself never asked for the plaque and rarely paused to look at it. He simply greeted coworkers with the same warm smile while pushing his custodial cart through the bright marble halls. A few days later, Victoria visited Daniel during his lunch break in the employee courtyard. Emily sat beside her father beneath colorful maple trees, happily eating a homemade sandwich while talking about school. Victoria handed Daniel a carefully prepared folder. Inside was the official charter establishing the Emily Foster Family Scholarship, created in memory of Daniel's late wife and dedicated to supporting single parents, first-generation college students, and young people who demonstrated kindness, perseverance, and humility. Daniel quietly read the first page before looking toward the autumn sky with grateful eyes. "She would have loved this," he whispered. Victoria nodded gently. Her love shaped the man who quietly shaped this company. Her story deserves to continue. Emily smiled brightly as she looked from her father to Victoria. "Daddy always says the best people are the ones who help others, even when nobody notices." Victoria smiled back. "Your father has reminded all of us what real success looks like." Seasons passed, projects succeeded, and new employees joined the company, yet one lesson never faded. Many people remembered the brilliant technology that transformed Bennett Technologies, but those who truly understood its history remembered something far greater. They remembered a humble father who walked through the front doors asking only for honest work, never asking the world to remember his name, and whose quiet dignity ultimately inspired an entire company to remember the value of grace, respect, second chances, and the simple courage to do what is right even when no one is watching.